Before I begin, a little history. Cape Cod Military Museum, if you haven't visited us, is because you can't. We don't have the building yet. In August of 2001, we had 6 acres and 2 barracks donated to us by the Joe Carter and the National Guard. And because the base was open, if you're anybody a long time, you could drive through the base and all that. September 11th came, and that knocked us down. Then a few years, a decade later, we were working on getting some land next to the trading post on the canal in Bourne, but it became a national registered place, and they thought that the World War II wouldn't fit with the Pilgrim trading with the Indians, so that thing. And then we're going to go into a basement of a museum in Hyannis, but we ran into difficulties renovating up to code. So we're looking for a home. We have a great story. We have a collection. We have a landing craft. We have uniforms, helmets, all kinds of stuff. You can see some of the pictures and stuff. There's an album of construction pictures. If you're really interested, all the buildings that were built over there, there's a picture of each type in that album. There's a map, and there's an album if you're super interested in that. But this is called Washburn at War. It's a local story. We do other stories of the Cradle of Invasion, where we deal with the training that was here and where the units went overseas, because the engineer amphibians went to the Pacific and to Europe. So we covered the whole globe from guys that trained right here. But Washburn at War, we're going to start with early stuff. According to Wacoit Bay researcher, who a lot of the stuff I got was from Neil Good. He's got the visor on there. May or may not have been the site of conflict between Vikings and Native Americans. In an Icelandic saga, Vikings returning from the Vinland after an unsuccessful attempt at establishing a settlement found 5 young Skraelings, which is their term for Indians, Native Americans, on the coast. Fearing they were spies, they slaughtered them. The Wampanoag legend tells of a huge sea monster that emerged from the sea and killed 5 of the chief's children. So that's quite a coincidence, if you ask me. When anti-aircraft units were sent from Camp Edwards to Iceland, the locals said that their ancestors used to visit Cape Cod and the islands, but the winters were too cold and they gave up trying to live there. Because you remember, Iceland gets hit by the Gulf Stream and has thermal pools. Iceland isn't as cold as you think it is, all right, compared to what we used to have for winters here. They used to drag houses out to Nantucket on sledges with oxen because the sea ice was so thick. It was a lot colder back in the day. Supposedly during the Revolutionary War, soldiers trained in boats in Wacoit Bay before heading south and crossing the Delaware River to attack the Hessians. In the first war on drugs, Prohibition, a rum runner was chased in Wacoit Bay by the Coast Guard. The boat was abandoned by the rum runners and set ablaze or dynamited as they escaped into the woods. The boat burned to the waterline and sank in the bay. You can see that's where the wreck lies. In the 1980s, divers on the wreck claimed there were bottles in and around it. But the most well-known and documented account of Washburn and Wacoit at War was when its land and waters were used by the U.S. Army as a training area during World War II. The Army got the job of shore-to-shore amphibious assaults because the Navy was recovering from the attack on Pearl Harbor and coming to grips with the Battle of the Atlantic happening right off our shores with the U-boats. The way things were going with the Germans in early 42, advancing towards Moscow and Stalingrad, there was a real fear the Russians may be knocked out of the war. A cross-channel attack for early 1943 would have been a desperate attempt to take pressure off the beleaguered Soviets. Camp Edwards was chosen for the initial amphibious training site because it could host a full division, had excellent railroad lines, and was near the shore. Because of the harsh winters would preclude amphibious training year-round, construction at Camp Gordon Johnson in Florida was started as a place for year-round training. The black area is actually Camp Edwards. And the little yellow cross, that's the airfield. So the headquarters of the Amphibious Corps was the old 102nd building on Camp Edwards that was the Yankee Division headquarters building. This was where the base commander used to be, and it was given to the Amphibious Engineer Amphibian Command. The Yankee Division was on coastal patrol from Maine to Florida, so they weren't on the base anymore. Behind the headquarters building was a memorial to the Yankee Division in World War I that had the tallest flagpole on the base. The base commander was an old cavalry officer from the South. He was ordered to move out of the HQ building into a small building across the parade ground. Well, he was not going to have an upstart unit have the tallest flagpole on the base. So he ordered the YD flagpole to be cut down, dragged across Logan Field to his new HQ. When the welders dropped the pole, it bent. There were still members of the Yankee Division on base, and they contacted Yankee Division Commander General Miles in Boston. The old colonel never got to spend one day in his new headquarters. He also had to pay for a new flagpole. The machine gun training school, radio school, diesel repair school, all stayed on Camp Edwards proper. It's interesting to note that the hodgepodge of uniforms, you got Army, and the guy in the back is a Coast Guardsman, because they pulled anybody that had small boat experience from the Marines, the Merchant Marines, the Coast Guard, the Army, Air Force, anybody that had small boat experience, they dragged them into the amphibious engineers. Now, you see the hat he's wearing, that black hat, the Donald Duck hat? That was taken out of service in the 1950s. Does anybody know why? Because drunk sailors were getting hit by cars because they were wearing all dark clothes. They made them wear the Dixie cup so they'd be seen at night and not run over. There were several places, because the Camp Edwards wasn't big enough and they needed places closer to the water. Camp Can Do It was built in Cotuit, and that's Point Isabella. Here's a photograph of Camp Can Do It. Camp Had Done It, play on words, was the Crosby Boatyard. They had a choice of renting it to the Army or having the Army take it and doing what they wanted. They had some control if they rented it, so they rented it to the Army. That building's still there, by the way. Now, this is Scranton Avenue. They had those boat sheds were for modifications. Camp Had Done It was actually for heavy-duty repair. But light maintenance and modifications, experimental stuff was done. You ever taken the Island Queen? Those are the boat sheds at the end of the dock before you head out. They're still there. 1942. And of course, the biggest place for training was Washburn Island and Coit Bay. There's a landing craft tank. That's the boat in the very bottom of the picture. That's the inlet that goes into Coit Bay. There's good striper fishing at those jetties, if you're interested. You can barely see them, but upper in the middle, there's 4 little lines going into water. Those are the boat piers. The Engineer Amphibian Command, this is their symbol, the seahorse. They handled, trained specialty troops in boat handling, clearing beach obstacles, defense of the landing site, setting up beach exits, medical evacuations, and many more duties. Washburn, or the island as it was referred to, was also home to the Amphibious Training Center. Now, the Amphibious Training Center trained regular troops in what to do in an amphibious assault. In May 1942, The construction facilities in Washburn was given to the Moore Company Incorporated, and buildings on Wacoit Bay and areas around it were commandeered by the military. The Webner Center, the Wacoit Yacht Club, the bottom floor of several homes were requisitioned for use by the amphibians. Washburn Island technically wasn't an island at the time. There was a causeway leading from Menauhant to Washburn. So you can see in this picture, there's land between the two. But that got blown out in 38 and I think in 44. Another way to reach Washburn, they built a pontoon bridge from the end of the sea pit. Then they built a solid bridge at Ovington Point on Seacoast Shores. If you look on the upper left, you can still see a pontoon bridge. And you can see all the tents, the little triangles up in the top. Those are all tents. And I think those are a mess hall is the rectangular building. They built roads. Here's another view coming in. And we think this vehicle is an ice cream truck. That's why there is a line, yes. It looks like an ice cream truck to me, okay? And we'll explain why there's such a line for it. But ice cream trucks existed at that time. Here's one of the warehouses. Here's the PX. Here's a mess hall. The food had to go somewhere, so here's a latrine. Now, the training, the amphibious engineers had to go through a 10-day commando course, and they wanted it really hard on the gentlemen. So they couldn't use the latrine. They had to dig slit trenches for the latrines. They couldn't shower. They had to wash in the water in the ocean. They were only allowed to eat K rations. So that's why there'd be a real line for that ice cream truck. You haven't any hot food in 10 days. All right. And this is one of the camps where the guys were trained. There's the showers for people on normal duty, not on the commando course. They had to get water for the showers, so this is the well field on Washburn. You had to pump the water. This is the pump house. It's a sexy picture. Look at that pump, huh? It was so strong they actually had fire hydrants. There was a fire hydrant system out there. Training's thirsty work, so the spigots. Some of these pipes are still sticking out of the ground out there.
What do you mean it was so strong they had to have fire hydrants?
The water pressure was strong enough to use a fire hose off it. That's how much pressure the pump house could generate. And then they had a lot of explosives work. So they had these little sheds. You can see it's right next to the water, not near anybody else. If it blows up, hopefully it won't take anybody out. Here's a larger storage facility. Keep this picture in mind. We're going to see a part of it later on in another photograph. But you had to bring in all the food and supplies for the guys. There was a lot of storehouses. This is at the garage. Sorry, it's a bad photograph, but that's the best I got. You can see all the vehicles they had out there.
What time period are we talking about?
1942.
42 to when?
All this is 42. They built them all in 42.
Everything is 42.
Yeah, they didn't have slowdowns and codes and all that stuff. This stuff went up in a couple of weeks. They didn't mess around.
So wasn't there
It's not going to be like the It's not going to be like the bridges that we're we're not going to see the end of the construction because don't kill the job wasn't a philosophy back then.
How long did it take them to put this whole thing together, do you know?
Well, they started in May and they were operational in June. Okay. They cut into the woods and they built tents. There were 18,000 troops in tents on the south coast.
Cut down all those trees.
Yes, they did. And those buildings on the right are the mess halls, and those are some of the tents. Each pyramid tent had 5 soldiers in it. Classrooms were hacked out of the forest as well. They had 3 48-foot training towers, so you could learn how to crawl down the cargo net into the boat. If you look on the bottom right, there's a wooden mock boat that the guys would crawl into. Is in the view of the towers. They don't look very tall, but if you were on the top of it, it would look very tall. You can see the bow of the fake boat at the bottom. This is one of the dredges they brought in. If you saw that, remember the picture of the bay, and we have a large picture of it to look at behind you on that easel, because they had to make channels in Wacoit Bay because it's a shallow bay for some of the bigger boats that came in. There were 3 dredges. You can see there's the dredge lines where they made channels. And those are LCVPs going in. And there's the pile driver to construct the piers. There were 4 piers. You can see there's another one out there. Because they were in a hurry. They weren't fooling around. This is pier number 1. If you can see, there's an early landing craft with no ramp and a prototype of the LCVP, which had a ramp, but it had the raised coxswain position. You see the steering wheel, the guy's raised up, which is great for seeing. But when we still in contact, the last surviving officer at D-Day, Neil Good, has a relationship with him. And he said when he came there as a cadet, he looked at that boat and said, that's the stupidest thing ever. They're going to shoot the coxswain and the boat's going to be out of control. So the production LCVP, they dropped the coxswain into the boat. But yeah, that's an early prototype.
Do you think that's within Wacoit Bay right there?
Yeah, that's Wacoit Bay, yeah. There's 4 of those in that picture, there's 4 of them. They're 800 to 900 feet long. See, there's where they put him in the production one. You see he's not on the back, on the top, he's behind the arm and plate. Here's pier number 2. This is a mooring pier. They'd raft the boats. There were 550 boats rafted in Wacoit Bay. There were 550 boats in Cotuit Bay. And nobody knows about it. That's why we need a museum.
How come you don't see the pilings?
They sold all the wood and stuff afterwards. There's still, if you dive, you can find some of the pilings. They sold the lumber after the war. This is an LCPR, which is landing craft vehicle, landing craft. Personnel R, which has a ramp. You can see it has a small ramp. The guys are all jammed up trying to get out of it. They had those here because, again, this is very early in the training. And here's the LCVP. It could take a small vehicle. And again, you can see the raised coxswain position, how vulnerable he would be to enemy fire. But this Jeep came from Washburn, is being landed on Martha's Vineyard. This is a fueling pier. I think it's pier number 1. You can see the fire extinguisher with the wheels and the cart. Notice the lights. There were most of the activity went on at night because in a landing you wanted the light of a full day when you hit the beach. So you had to form up at night to be able to hit the beach at dawn. So a lot of their training went on at night. In fact, no civilians were allowed near the shore or on the water at night. But that's an 800-foot pier going from Washburn into Wacoit Bay. They needed fuel. There's the fuel tanks. One's gasoline, one's diesel. This is period number 3. You can still see on the construction. They're still driving stuff into the ground with a pile driver. You can see that's an LCPR. It's got a small ramp in the front. So there's all different types of boats here in the very beginning. Again, like I said, most of the training was at night.
Do they have LSTs there?
No, they couldn't fit in Coit Bay. But they came out of New Bedford at some of the landings on Martha's Vineyard. Hmm?
My pilot commanded a flotilla of LSTs.
Oh, wow, terrific. Yeah, no, they actually used them in the invasions of Martha's Vineyard. But they came out of New Bedford. Landing craft vehicle personnel.
LST is landing ship tank.
No, LST is large, slow target. All right. So some of these surprise landings were not graciously received by the Coast Guardsmen guarding Martha's Vineyard. Many a guy ended up looking down the barrel of a .45. Because, this boat lands, this is right after, it's a few months after Pearl Harbor. Everyone's edgy. So, but not everybody was so unkind to visitors on Martha's Vineyard. If you landed on Jimmy Cagney's estate, he'd bring you in and make you lunch. Okay? In fact, Jimmy Cagney and Miss Catherine Cornell, she's the woman on the left in the stage door canteen, entertained the entire 544th Regiment of the 4th Engineer Special Brigade in August of 1943. That's her really last big movie role. But she lived on Martha's Vineyard as well.
Catherine Cornell, my grandfather's girlfriend at one.
Oh, you're an interesting guy. You're going to talk to you.
I got a history.
Civilians were not allowed on the water at night because of all the nocturnal training activities. Civilians were allowed on the bay during the day if they had a license. The license had to be on the boater at all times. It was usually kept in a medicine bottle. Sailboats have the right of way except when it comes to military craft. The amphibian engineers would circle around civilian sailors showing off, especially if they were girls. Sandy Abbott said, one day, a landing barge bumped into her catboat she was sailing in. The soldiers were very upset by this as they knew they shouldn't be doing this. No damage was done, however. The girls later got their revenge. Nancy Barman and her fellow 12-year-olds, including Sandy Abbott, staged a capsizing of their little sailboat near the shore where the amphibious engineers were training. Instantly, 20 soldiers were doing their best overhead strokes out to rescue the girls. The girls were laughing hysterically as they all could swim, and they capsized and righted their own boat quite regularly. The soldiers were angry as they had all swum out in full uniform. The girls' mothers were also very upset with them. But the girls could have gotten back into their mother's good graces by doing a little beach combing. The K rations the troops in the commando course were forced to eat, there were little packets of instant coffee. And coffee in 1942 and 43 was rationed, except for the military. So the GIs knew they could get a cup of real coffee somewhere else on the island, and then throw their little foil packet of the coffee away, and it would wash up on the shore intact, and the girls could barter favors. I want to sleep over. No. You want some coffee? Yeah. So it was a currency they could use to get back in their mother's good graces. America was still very panicky at this time. A report came that German heavy bombers from Brittany were on the way to bomb Cape Cod. All the 50 caliber machine guns on Washburn, this is Pomponset, by the way, but those same guys, were sent to Woods Hole to protect it. No one thought that the Germans did not have an aircraft that could reach America, and that 50 caliber machine guns would be completely ineffective against high-flying aircraft. But a panic's a panic, and so they went back.
How about submarine activity off the coast?
Oh, that's the next lecture I'm going to work on. It's Civil Air Patrol Base 18 and the U-boat menace. I'm working on it. The specialty troops units handled the boats and did all the other landing activities were called Engineer Special Brigades. To facilitate the planned cross-channel invasion, the 1st Engineer Special Brigade was ordered to go overseas. And this is why they're the greatest generation. Upon learning that the 591st was to be sent overseas, 2 young lieutenants immediately went out and bought every bottle of 151 rum they could find in the town of Falmouth. Lieutenant Barnum and Yates then emptied out all of their clothes out of their footlocker to put the rum in instead. The other officers made room in their footlockers for Yates and Barnum's belongings. And this is why they're the greatest generation. On August 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Brown of the 1st Engineer Special Brigade boarded a train to Camp Edwards to go to New York Harbor to board a ship for their move over the seas. It was hot and stuffy. He was weighed down with all his gear. Lieutenant Brown probably was hungover. He ate a greasy meat sandwich, and he inhaled a lot of coal smoke from the locomotive. Most of the trains in this time were still coal-fired. You had to wash everything and take a shower when you got done your train ride because you had black soot on you. When he got to the docks, he broke formation to kneel and puke into the water. Later on board the USS Wakefield, he was censoring the men's mail when he came across several mentions in letters to mothers that she had no reason to worry about them. Their lieutenant was so religious that he prayed before he boarded the ship. The 1st Engineer Special Brigade was full of power squadron members and mechanics recruited through advertisements in boating magazines. Many local Cape Cod fishermen were also included in the amphibians. The Navy became jealous of the Army's prowess in amphibious operations and demanded that only Navy men handle the boats. The 1st Engineer Special Brigade was involved in the invasion of North Africa, and the men were so disappointed with the Navy, the way they handled the ships and boats. They repaired 60 abandoned landing craft and then ran a school of how to instruct the Navy men in the proper landing craft techniques. And what did Admiral King do? He ordered them to become truck drivers. So we had 3,700 of the country's best small boatmen driving trucks in North Africa because the Navy was jealous of how good our amphibians were. Yeah, that rivalry is something else. It still goes on. Army-Navy game, you watch the game, it's vicious. This is the patch for the Engineer Special Brigade. The 2nd Engineer Special Brigade picked up the nickname Cape Cod Commandos from all the British commandos that were featured in the Pathé newsreels shown before movies. Although the engineers were quick to point out, commandos hit and run, they said, we hit, but we don't run. The 2nd Engineer Special Brigade liked the nickname and kept it. They would still be heard to call out to each other, buck up, you Cape Cod Commando, while landing on some Pacific island clear across the world. When this patch was manufactured for the new unit, 342 women and girls of Falmouth boarded trucks and jeeps to go over the bridge to Washburn and hand sew on patches. They spent 2,309 hours sewing on 20,000 patches. With the departure of the 1st Engineer Special Brigade, the 2nd Engineer Special Brigade was split in 2 units. The 2nd unit became the 3rd Engineer Special Brigade. The 2nd and 3rd ESB were filled up with new recruits to bring them up to capacity. The Cape Cod Commandos endured very strenuous training. There would be forced road marches of 12 miles while wearing full 60-pound packs. Anybody know where this is in Falmouth? Neil and I were able to locate it. The house is still there. It's right across from the Shumet Wildlife, Audubon Wildlife in the Shumet. The house is still there. There were obstacle courses that the men had to run. This photo is from Camp Gordon Johnson, Florida, but it's the same type of setup. The obstacle course was left on the island after the war. Adventurous youths from Falmouth would swim over and try their hand at the course. This led to a local obstacle course craze in the late 40s and 50s, where youth would set up obstacle courses and invite the public to watch their time trials. There was a commando efficiency course on the far side of Coit Bay in Mashpee. Briefly, the course was a circuitous route through the woods with the underbrush, where the soldiers were confronted with dummies in various conditions of hostility. There were pop-up dummies, swing-down dummies, and one dummy with a bladder filled with pig's blood that, when bayoneted, would drench the soldier in gore. The culmination of the training was a 100-yard mud crawl. There were mud-filled lanes for the soldiers to crawl through. There were 6 .30 caliber machine guns firing live rounds from fixed positions 30 inches off the ground. You see that wire? That's where the bullets were going, 30 inches. Okay? There were explosive charges set to slew mud and debris on the advancing doughboys. Literature of the course bragged that no one was killed while doing it, which means people were shot. Here is Henry C. Allen's account. I was so scared that I wouldn't know if my trembling legs would help me over the top of a long trench. Could I stay low enough to slide up and over? My time came. The next few seconds were terrifying. I was drenched in sweat, my face and neck and back and chest. My mouth was totally dry. I was breathing heavily. Finally reached the point where I was to slip out to the trench and begin crawling toward the stationary machine gun. Bullets whined just inches above my head. Then, without warning, a simulated mine exploded no less than 5 feet from me. Fortunately, I kept my body flat to the ground. After it seemed like an eternity, I crawled by the machine gun and was ordered to stand up and join the group of soldiers that had preceded me. This course was actually on Camp Edwards proper. It wasn't on Washburn, but they went over to do it. And that's an actual photograph of the course. There were other types of booby traps in training. Margaret Monroe and her 16-year-old friend Isabella were sunbathing in the nude in the dunes near Sedge Lot. To their horror, a landing craft that was out on the Sound came to shore right in front of them. The troops followed their young lieutenant as he led them charging onto the dune. The girls were stunned and speechless, clutching their blankets, trying to cover up. Lieutenant crests the hill, sees the terrified girls, and yells, "Company, halt!" The girls, then he said, "Company, retreat!" And they ran back to the boat. The girls didn't understand that there were no longer any inaccessible areas for the men and vehicles of the amphibian engineers. Ducks, this is Provincetown. Imagine driving that duck off that cliff. I don't think they let you do that now. They did the scientific evaluation of the duck in Provincetown because the sand was very similar to Normandy.
Is that a duck boat?
It's a duck boat, yeah. Here they are coming out of Coit Bay. So they can go anywhere. They can go land, water, anywhere. There was even something that go even more places. This is an alligator or buffalo. And these were propelled by the tracks, the paddles on the tracks. One of the problems, though, the people of Austerville complained that they silted up the harbor so much they covered the oyster beds. Here it is on land.
Excuse me, you bring up to mind something I've been thinking about right along. Was there issues between the civilians and this amphibious group, or was this a fairly
Well, everyone was pretty much, involved, Pearl Harbor, everyone was pretty go, yeah, yeah. And there were dead bodies floating by from the German U-boats. So yeah, you wanted guys with guns around you, yeah.
Met with a lot of civilian interference.
No, they did not.
There was even, the land I have at the corner of Choptank and Central Ave, when I first bought it, had a trench at the corner of Choptank and Central Ave.
Right.
Dug out, which was there.
Yeah. We're going to do questions and answers at the end of the lecture, so if we could, I'll get sidetracked and forget where I am. All right, so there was a seep, which is the cousin of the duck, and it's called a seep not because of Jeep, but Jeeps were called peeps originally. Okay, and the name Jeep came in from a character in a Popeye cartoon that was magical and go anywhere. So they were originally called peeps, then then changed to Jeeps. So this is a seagoing peep or seep. And that can go in. This is a picture on Washburn. If you wanted to get away from the aqua cheetah, which you've probably never heard of, the safest place to go was in the water because it drowned a couple of engineer amphibians before they canceled this project. You can see how low the seaboard is on this vehicle. It's terrible. There's quite a bit of explosive used in the training. Military training was and is very dangerous. Several drownings. There's explosions, killed men on Washburn. There were 50 caliber machine gun ranges on Washburn. One veteran interviewed many years later was still haunted by a soldier who was hit in the head by the weapon's powerful slug. If the men were injured, there is one vehicle that was thought up and fabricated right here on Washburn Island. The Jeep ambulance. This little Jeep could carry 4 wounded on it. And if you did this by hand, you'd have 8 to 16 soldiers involved instead of 1. And it's small to fit in the LCVP. So it was a great invention. This is on D-Day. The gentleman in the back of that last Jeep ambulance is a German. But this is D+1 or something on D-Day. There would have been target towing planes for the 50 caliber shooting. There'd be planes have been simulating strafing on the beach, smoke screens, smoke mortars going off. It was very, very exciting to be living around the island in 1942. The training was very frenetic, and the pressure to have forces ready for the cross-channel invasion was intense. There were no days off, very hard training, merciless instructors. The British commandos were instructors, and they're kind of savage. And, very few passes, and morale was actually very low. They had no movies on the island. In fact, they only had, they couldn't even show training films because they only had DC current electricity on the island. Soldiers that couldn't stand the constant training without a break would go AWOL. Not desert, but sneak off the base for a night on the town. Ironically, the EAC had trained the soldiers exactly how to do this. You have to make a little raft, so you put all your clothes in the little raft, swim across to the mainland, and then you get dry clothes to get into. One young officer accompanying the MPs saw a young, something not mentioned, I jumped, in polite society and literature on Camp Evans is the influx of ladies of the night. It was big business. The MPs would search local bars and clubs for our wayward Cape Cod commandos. One young officer accompanying MPs saw a young prostitute with dyed gray hair. He had to ask her why. She said, "Boys miss their mothers." Truth is stranger than fiction. Barely trained themselves, the Engineer Amphibians Training Center welcomed the 45th Infantry Division. known as the Thunderbirds. The 45th was a National Guard unit made of men from Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. There are many Native Americans in the 45th, and Cape Codders were fascinated by these warriors from the West. The Native Americans were happy to be in Massachusetts, as they could not drink in bars in their home states. There was a shortage of landing craft. The engineers had to learn their skills in donated boats and obsolete Navy boats. Here's some 45th soldiers practicing in a mock landing craft on the shore. There was a future celebrity in the 45th Infantry Division. Anybody know him? Bill Malden, the cartoonist, Willie and Joe. He wasn't drawn at that time, though. But this cartoon shows that he went through amphibious training because of the hand and foot placement. One would think if you were going down the cargo net, you'd put your hand on the horizontal ropes to hold on to. But if you did that, the guy coming above you would step on your hand. So the feet went on the horizontal ropes and your hands stayed on the vertical ropes. And because he actually was pretty accurate in a lot of his drawings. Because he drew this the correct way, you knew he went through amphibious training. And the amphibious training command had jump boots. So somehow he had waggled a pair of jump boots for himself because they're waterproof. So he was wearing jump boots. That's not normally what the guys wore. The next division in was the Texas Division, 36th Texas Division. Oh, by the way, Bill Malden sold cartoons to the Boston Herald while he was here. The Texas Division trained in amphibious tactics. Cape Codders and these tough hombres got along splendidly, although there were complaints from the Texans about the lack of spices in the New England diet. Many of the officers' wives followed the Texans up to Cape Cod and were crammed into any room available on the Cape. The Soviets had slowed down the German advances. The British had stopped the Germans from going into Egypt, and the pressure to do a cross-channel invasion in 43 had lessened. It was Operation Sledgehammer. It would have been doomed. I mean, we barely made it in 44. If we attacked in 43, it would have been crushed. The Americans were going to get their baptism of fire with an invasion of North Africa instead. Massachusetts resident George S. Patton was in charge of the secret operation. In his book, From Texas to Rome, commander of the 36th Division, General Walker, related this story. General Patton flew into Falmouth Airport and informed General Walker that the 36th Division was going to be under his command in a secret operation. Patton stated he wanted to address all the officers that were going to serve under him in one speech. General Walker informed him that he could not assemble all of the officers at one place as they would lose a whole day of training because half of the officers were on Camp Edwards proper and half of them were on Washburn. Patton agreed to give 2 speeches. While accompanying Patton, Walker missed phone calls from Chief of Army General George Marshall. When Patton was finished, General Walker finally returned to his headquarters and received a call from an irate General Marshall informing him that under no circumstances was General Patton to give a speech. Because of this breach of security, the 36th was not sent to North Africa. History was changed right over there. The Texans were tough hombres, but didn't really use foul language that much. Patton's profanity-laced oration went over like a lead balloon. Plus, they were in the Louisiana maneuvers with him as the oppositional force, and Patton and his tankers cheated. So they didn't like him anyways because they cheated at the war games they were in Louisiana. During his visit to Cape Cod, General Patton changed into civilian clothing borrowed Walker's car along with his driver. He then disappeared for a clandestine mission into Hyannis. His mistress was his niece by marriage, and she was a Red Cross worker in Boston. So it's very likely that Miss Jean Gordon and George Patton had a rendezvous in Hyannis. She accompanied George in the Third Army as a Red Cross girl in England and then through France and Germany. Another celebrity on the island was Ralph Ingersoll. He was the owner and publisher of PM newspapers. The 41-year-old joined the Army to avoid being drafted by his local draft board. The draft board had wanted him to serve as a way of shutting him up in his newspaper. By joining, Ralph could choose his duty station. He chose the amphibians as a way to get where the action was quickly. Private Ingersoll kept his nose clean and was, by all accounts, a very good soldier. In fact, he was the top scorer with his M1 rifle. After hearing good reports about the conduct of Private Ingersoll, he was taken to Washburn and made an officer. He then wrote the book, or at least edited the manuals, on how to conduct amphibious landings. Ralph went on to write 2 best-selling books on his war experiences and came up with the idea behind the Phantom Army to help deceive the Germans about D-Day. In a stroke of total genius, he wondered if mock landing craft planes and vehicles could be made of inflatable rubber. He was authorized to go to Akron and Goodyear, and they said, sure, that's not a problem. Here's one of his inflatable tanks. Because they kept the German planes flying high from up above, you'd take pictures and you'd think there were real tanks there. And it kept them fooled that we were going to land in Pas de Calais. So he saved thousands and thousands of lives with his stroke of genius. Like today's snowbirds, the amphibians headed to Florida in the winter, most by rail, but some sailed all the way to Camp Gordon Johnson, the Gulf side of Florida near Tampa Bay. In the spring, the 3rd and newly formed 4th Engineer Special Brigade returned to Ricoit, again mostly by rail, but some sailed the 1,270 miles back to Cape Cod. This is one of the boats that made the 38-day voyage. Does anybody know what the thing on the back is? It's an outhouse. They weren't designed to have toilets because they were only supposed to be short things. This was the mess hall one, and they had a outhouse on the back of it. The 36th Division ended up having to return to Camp Edwards as they were not going to be used in the North Africa invasion. This was a time before television and internet entertainment was self-generated. Remember the old Judy Garland movies? Mickey Rooney? Let's put on a show. That was real because you didn't have internet, cable, TV, radio wasn't that great. So they would put on shows to entertain themselves. The Engineer Special Brigade Seahorse Scandals was very popular. It debuted at the Katuitt USO, but was performed everywhere, including Fort Devens and Washburn Island stage. It was revived several times. Every time a visiting brass was coming in, they'd have to get the play out. The play was so good, the War Department requested a copy of it. In 43, there's a stage. That comes up in another picture, so remember that. The warehouse, remember this stage. Things had calmed down, because like I said, there wasn't going to be a cross-channel invasion. There was a large 40 by 80 tent set up for recreational room at Washburn with ping pong tables and the like. There were bands and orchestras for each Engineer Special Brigade. Women finally made it onto the island in 1943. The engineers, these are the Texas girls that came on. One of the bands was the Swingphibians, was a jazz band. They would play at the Menauhant Yacht Club, the Webner Boathouse, the Coonamessett Club. They probably played here. I just don't know they played here. Here's some of the slang of the time. A dull, dizzy GI would hope that a killer-diller band might attract some khaki-wacky dames. He would say to her, "Sugar, are you rationed?" If she wasn't, they would take their stompers onto the dance floors and hope they were the best dusty shin crackers there. Translation, a girl crazy GI would hope that a GI crazy girl would dance with him with a killer band. Sugar, are you rationed? Do you have a boyfriend? And stompers of feet, and shin crackers is slang for dancing. It's amazing how much dancing was part of this generation. It was huge, probably better for it. The 336th Tank Destroyer Battalion of the 36th Infantry Division came up with a hit play of their own. It was called Tanks to You. It played at various places on the base, then Fort Devens, and even in Boston. The soldiers decided to share their popular play, Tanks to You, with the public by performing it several times at the Falmouth USO. You think about the civilians who want to entertain the troops. Here they are, they're entertaining the civilians. Because again, there wasn't TV, there wasn't. This was a different time. If any real transvestitism or homosexuality occurred, it would be dealt with very severely. There was a very popular lieutenant colonel in the 534th Engineer Special Brigade caught in a homosexual act with a young private on Washburn. They were both court-martialed and booted out of the Army with dishonorable discharges. The going theory was that homosexual behavior would be fatal to any unit in combat. The boys were homesick, they missed their families, their friends, girlfriends, and pets. They adopted mascots to fill this void. Washburn had several dogs for different units. Osterville had Butch, the ugliest soldier in the Engineer Amphibious Command. Camp Canduit had an otter named AWOL. He was busted from sergeant to private after he bit Major Trainer. There were never enough pets to go around, and civilians had to keep a close eye on their pets. Soldiers urged to return adopted fox terrier. There's an 83-year-old woman, they stole her dog in McCoy. Jerry Ellis, the co-founder of the Cape Cod Military Museum, had his husky stolen by a soldier during World War II. And this was 2 weeks after the dog had saved his little sister who had fallen in the canal. The boy soldiers had to be ordered to release all the chipmunks they had captured and adopted as pets. We had always thought there were African-American troops on Washburn. One of the quartermaster units had a C after its number, designating it as a colored unit. The military was segregated at this time. Blacks were not initially allowed in combat units. The majority served in service units, cook, supply, transportation, etc. We suspected there were African-American troops manning the low-altitude barrage balloons for the EAC on Washburn, but have yet to find proof. That's that balloon hanging off the landing craft. What that did is there were cables that went off of it, and it would go up in the air so planes would have a hard time strafing your craft. They could hit the cable and cut their wings off. That's a balloon, there's cables, and so the plane couldn't attack you low. It would have to fly above the balloon or it could get crashed. But one of the reasons we think the balloon men are colored is there's absolutely no mention of balloon men in our research on the accounts from the Engineer Special Brigade, so more than likely they were colored. And if they were, that'd be great because the only colored unit to land on D-Day was the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. So if those guys were here, we have another unit that landed on D-Day. One of the things that cemented it, our belief that African Americans were on Washburn, was heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis was doing a 100-stop boxing exhibition tour of U.S. bases to raise morale for African American troops. His first stop was Fort Devens. His second stop was Camp Edwards. Joe then added Washburn Island to his already very busy schedule. The only logical reason is that there were more than a few colored troops here. Neil Good, our researcher, found photos of Joe Louis boxing on Washburn Island. Now, in this photograph, it appears all of the troops are white. However, we found a newsreel footage of this fight, and it pans the crowd, half of the 4,000 people that saw this fight, 2,000 of them were African American. And we know exactly where it happened because they put them on that stage. Remember the picture of the stage I showed earlier? Here's the thing in the Camp Edwards News of them setting up a portable ring in that stage. Because you can see the shadow of the ring, the peak above it, so they're fighting in that ring. And you can see that warehouse. Remember I said watch the warehouse? That's the corner of that same warehouse that was in the earlier picture. So if you can find where that warehouse was, you can find where Joe Louis fought. He wasn't alone. There was a whole undercard. In fact, the greatest boxer of all time, Sugar Ray Robinson, was there. Pound for pound, one of the best ever. They then went to Camp Edwards and visited the wounded at the hospital on the base. And these gentlemen were wounded in North Africa. One of the soldiers that had been blinded and his eyes were recovering asked the bandages to be removed so he'd get a chance to see Joe Louis. That's how big boxing, much of a hero he was. Joe Louis then went to the Black USO Club in Mashpee and conducted an orchestra. When winter approached, the amphibians went south, never to return. All the buildings were razed in 1944, but this was not to be the end of Washburn in World War II. Camp Edwards was converted to become one of the largest convalescent rehabilitation hospitals in America. At its peak, there were over 5,000 hospital beds. Not all war wounds are physical. Here are battle-fatigued soldiers being marched from the train to the hospital on the base. You wouldn't march wounded guys. So Washburn was chosen to be a place for recreation and recovery for the soldiers. There were towers with lifeguards, rescue boats, tents for other activities. 800 soldiers a day were shipped over in the morning, and then another 800 brought over at noon, and the first 800 brought back. So there's 1,600 recovering troops on Washburn a day. Soldiers recovering, if you went to the beach by yourself and you were the only guy with one arm or one leg, you're going to feel very self-conscious. If there's 400 other guys with one leg, you're going to learn to play ping pong against somebody else with one leg or with one arm. So it was really great for them to be amongst other wounded men during their recovery on Washburn Island. Many of the wounded were familiar with the area as they'd done arduous training for combat right here. Again, learning to swim with one arm missing was tough, but they would be more comfortable with other men. The hospital held dances at the Menauhant Yacht Club, and local girls would dance with the one-armed man or the one-legged man to help them feel comfortable dancing with their injuries. Troops from Washburn brought an end to the Nazi Third Reich, landing in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, southern France. The engineer special brigades landed in countless Pacific islands, played a major role in the defeat of the cruel Empire of Japan. And lastly, Wacoit's beauty helped heal our wounded soldiers. What a place. Any questions, comments? Did you like it? Well, yeah, did anybody?